For more than 30 years, Johnny Carson occupied a position in American culture so powerful that few truly understood its reach while it was happening. A position not defined merely by ratings or longevity, but by quiet authority, by the ability to shape reputations without ever appearing to do so. And while audiences across the country saw a relaxed, self-deprecating host who laughed easily and welcomed everyone with the same measured warmth, what they did not see was the private Johnny Carson, the man who watched Hollywood with a scalpel rather than a smile, cataloging its illusions, dissecting its failures, and forming judgments that, though rarely spoken aloud, carried enormous weight within the industry itself. Carson was not simply a comedian who happened to host a talk show. He was a student of performance, an obsessive observer of acting craft, whose critical instincts had been sharpened long before he ever sat behind the Tonight Show desk. Forged during childhood afternoons, spent escaping the bleakness of the Great Depression inside dark movie theaters, where he learned to distinguish authenticity from affectation, truth from technique, and later refined through his early years as a magician. A discipline that teaches above all else how easily an audience can be deceived if they want to be. And it was this dual education, in illusion and observation, that made Carson uniquely dangerous as a critic, because he understood not only how stars were made, but how audiences were trained to believe in them. When Carson inherited The Tonight Show in 1962, he also inherited Hollywood's front door, the place every major actor, singer, and celebrity eventually had to pass through to be validated. And while the public assumed the desk was a place of promotion and celebration, Carson understood it as something far more revealing. A pressure chamber where the safety net of scripts, directors, and editing vanished, leaving only intelligence, timing, presence, and truth. And over time, Carson noticed patterns that disturbed him, patterns in which certain performers soared in films, yet faltered disastrously the moment they had to speak unscripted, think on their feet, or reveal anything resembling inner life. And these moments, invisible to casual viewers, accumulated in Carson's memory, forming a silent ledger of Hollywood frauds. Stars elevated not by ability, but by machinery. Faces manufactured into icons by studios that assumed audiences would never notice the difference. Carson rarely confronted this publicly, not out of kindness, but because he understood the greater power of restraint. He knew that mockery, when delivered casually, could wound more deeply than accusation. And so his sharpest criticisms were saved for private conversations, whispered impressions delivered late at night to writers, producers, and confidants. Impressions so precise and devastating that they circulated through industry circles like ghost stories, altering how certain actors were perceived long after the cameras stopped rolling. At the center of Carson's unspoken indictment stood figures like Sonny Tufts, whose very name became, to Carson, a symbol of everything artificial about Hollywood stardom, a man whose good looks and studio grooming propelled him into leading roles despite performances so emotionally vacant that Carson reportedly marveled at how entire films could be constructed around the absence of inner life. And Tufts was not mocked merely for being bad, but for representing a system that rewarded appearance over effort, charisma over truth, a system Carson found intellectually offensive. Jane Mansfield followed closely behind, not because Carson believed she lacked intelligence. On the contrary, he believed she was painfully aware of her own limitations, but because she chose spectacle over substance, retreating into a caricature of herself rather than risking growth. And what disturbed Carson most was not her performance style, but her refusal to evolve, her acceptance of publicity as a substitute for craft, a choice that, in his mind, exposed a cynical bargain between studios and audiences that assumed viewers were too shallow to demand more. Tab Hunter presented a different kind of mystery, one that Carson found almost tragic. A performer whose blankness became his greatest asset, allowing audiences to project fantasies onto a surface that revealed nothing. And Carson observed with a mixture of fascination and frustration how directors contorted scripts, minimized dialogue, and surrounded Hunter with stronger actors to disguise an emotional emptiness that, in Carson's view, should have disqualified him from leading man status. Altogether, though later revelations about Hunter's private life would add complexity to this judgment, suggesting that fear and concealment may have contributed to his stiffness, Yet at the height of his fame, Carson saw only the result: a star system capable of mistaking silence for depth. Mamie Van Doren, to Carson, represented the system pushed to its logical extreme, a performer not merely lacking range, but built as a deliberate imitation, a copy of Marilyn Monroe stripped of vulnerability and talent, a product so obviously manufactured that Carson found its success insulting, proof that studios believed audiences would accept anything if it looked familiar enough. While Tony Curtis occupied a more complicated position in Carson's mind, initially serving as an example of catastrophic miscasting, a handsome face forced into roles that exposed his limitations so glaringly that Carson delighted in skewering the absurdity of it all. Yet Curtis ultimately distinguished himself by refusing to remain trapped by those limitations, working relentlessly to improve, earning Carson's respect not because he became great, but because he tried, because he acknowledged failure rather than hiding behind it. And this distinction mattered deeply to Carson, whose true contempt was reserved not for imperfection, but for pretense. Zsa Zsa Gabor, finally, stood apart from all the others, because she committed the one act Carson respected above all else: honesty, openly abandoning the idea of acting altogether, and embracing celebrity as performance, turning herself into a brand with no illusion of depth. And while Carson did not consider her an artist, he recognized her self-awareness and found it oddly refreshing in an industry built on denial. Taken together, these judgments reveal the darker truth beneath Carson's genial public image. He was not merely entertaining America, he was studying it, diagnosing a culture increasingly comfortable with image over substance, celebrity over ability, and illusion over effort. And from his seat at the center of the entertainment universe, he watched as Hollywood gradually shifted from a system that at least pretended to value craft into one that openly rewarded exposure, a shift that disturbed him deeply, even as he benefited from it. And perhaps this is why Carson himself grew increasingly withdrawn over the years, retreating from public life after his retirement, because he understood better than most how fame corrodes authenticity, how performance replaces personality, and how easily truth becomes optional when illusion pays better, leaving behind a legacy that is more unsettling than nostalgic. A reminder that behind every smiling icon may sit a silent observer, watching, judging, and recording the difference between who we pretend to be and who we actually are.